let's talk about overconsumption and abuse of natural resources. So the issue is that in the past years, we see an increase in the consumption of natural resources and the abuse of natural resources and waste. And this is some data from the United States. You can see how there is a substantial increase in the wasting of food, in the extraction of materials, in the misuse of natural resources. And the issue is that we are exploiting the planet and extracting resources at a deficit. And every year there is a 20% deficit in terms of what we can regenerate, what the planet regenerates compared to what is being consumed, which means that in very few years we will reach a point where we'll be running out of resources, prices will increase, and there will be shortages. We already experienced some of this because of the war in Ukraine and other small catastrophes. But this is where we're going. And we see that there is decline in the population of living animals in the planet. And you might say it's a population growth, but it's very easy to show that this is not the case. So in the United States, we see that it's only 3% of the population, but most of the overconsumption is in these rich countries and not in the poor countries. So the population grew by 6%, consumption grew by 400%. So it's not population growth. You can see a very clear correlation between the increase in GDP, the industrialization, extraction of resources, and these ramifications of consumption. Why do we overconsume? Well, companies and maybe textbooks taught us that by consuming more we'll be happier. This is the seed because there is research demonstrating that this is not the case. It's partially the case because what matters for happiness is not how much we consume, it's how much we consume or gain compared to others. So there is this kind of rat house where people are trying to consume more to improve their relative position, and we are not really improving our condition. Even if people have the intent to not consume more than their fair share, they do. They are not aware of that even. So if we talk about the tragedy of the commons, the work of Ostrom, she explained why in many cases it's very difficult to have an organization that limits such consumption, and there are very rare cases where this is possible, but it's far from trivial. So we can see, for instance, how companies are inflating consumption through advertising, and as we move to the internet, when people spend more than 10 hours per day in front of screens, their impact is much more substantial. I was surprised with the statistic that children are exposed to around 683 ads per day. If you start counting how much advertising you see per day, you'll be stunned. It's all over, it's all around us. And this is directly related to consumption. Now, the issue is that consumption is also linked to production. So we see overproduction of certain resources. I can go industry by industry, but just looking at agriculture, we can see how extreme the industrial production in the field of agriculture. Or you think about electronics, so you realize that the life cycle of electronic product becomes shorter, and we need to replenish it much faster. So in all of these industries, you can trace this pattern of overproduction, overconsumption, pollution, and damage to the environment. So how can we deal with this? Corporate social responsibility. Indeed, there is this trend of companies trying to produce environmental friendly products, prevent pollution, enhance recycling, and they're trying to be nice. But some companies do this as greenwashing. They are not really doing all of that, they are just announcing that they do. Take British Petroleum, which is now called Beyond Petroleum. So they invested more in the campaign of their new logo than they invested in emerging energy sources. So still 98% of their products are oil, gas, etc., but they have this new logo. Even if companies are genuine about their efforts, think about the recycling of plastic. About 90% of the plastic that is being recycled is not being recycled. This plastic travels in the seas until it gets to some place and where they either bury it in the ground or burn it. But very little of it is being recycled in countries where it is. Like Germany, these are the countries where you see the most extreme use of plastic, because people think, oh, it's being recycled, so let's use more of it. So there is this kind of rebound effect. Enhancing sustainability was a key goal of the United Nations. You are probably familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and they provide targets for governments, for companies, but they are not providing guidance how to achieve it. And in fact, we see that most of the focus goes into efficient production techniques, and these production techniques have a rebound effect. So I'm giving you one example in the automobile industry. So when you see an improvement in the fuel economy, you would expect to see less consumption of fuel. But what we see instead is that the horsepower and the weight of cars increases in parallel, and also the share of the SUVs. So eventually we don't see really a decline in the consumption of fuel because of this rebound effect. And I can go and show you this effect also in other cases. So what we see is that there is overconsumption of resources leading to pollution, loss of animal population, and this is inflated by public policy, which is many times self-contradictory, consumer behavior, international treaties, etc. And this is a very complex problem to solve. And one way to deal with this, which hasn't received much attention, is dealing with the demand side. To convince consumers to consume less, maybe to consume wisely and reuse products or share products, and consume per need, not per desire in a way. But this is voluntary. There is no government that restricts consumer use, at least not consistently and not in the modern world. Think about also the fashion industry. We used to have 4 seasons, and now we have 50 seasons. And people are using clothes for much shorter period, buying more clothes, they are wasting them, the quality is lower. So we seem to be not successful in that trend. So the challenge here is that on the one hand we want to restrict consumption, but at the same time we want to maintain a certain standard of living and make sure that the poor are not disadvantaged. We can already see the inconsistency between maintaining a decent standard of living and overconsumption. When you're trying to deal with one problem, you're probably creating more of the other problem. So it seems that neither policy has been effective. Neither supply side nor demand side approaches. And in the recent World Economic Forum, it's the first time that we see that the main risk factors for humanity are all environmental. So this is relatively new, and you can look at different indicators showing how negative impact we make on the environment, and in turn the environment makes for human. So what can be done? We need bold and well-defined goals, credible actions. But decades of words and warnings have not changed society business as usual trajectory. The policies are, again, well known. We need to invest in green industries, we need to tax undesirable practices, we need to advance an ecological state, and there are many ideas, but apparently they are very challenging to implement, and they are very unpopular for governments to pursue.